Frozen lynx with 3 cubs begs to enter the house. Woman is shocked when this happened. The harsh winter winds howled through the Rocky Mountains, their fierce intensity painting the landscape in endless shades of white. Emily Carter stood at the window of her wooden cabin, watching as another blizzard threatened to erase any trace of the world beyond her small sanctuary. The isolation that had once seemed like a refuge now wrapped around her like a heavy cloak, reminding her of the choice she'd made 3 years ago to leave her career as a wildlife biologist behind. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. Her daily routine had become as predictable as the mountain seasons. Wake before dawn, check the firewood supplies, monitor the surrounding wildlife, and document her observations in the old field journal that had become her closest companion. The simplicity of this existence had brought her a peace that the academic world never could, even if sometimes the silence pressed in a little too closely. The cabin's interior reflected Emily's minimalist approach to life. A small desk covered in research papers and field notes, walls adorned with detailed sketches of local wildlife, and shelves lined with well-worn books on animal behavior. The soft glow of her solar-powered lamp cast shadows across her latest journal entry, where she'd been documenting the unusually severe weather patterns affecting the mountain's ecosystem. As the evening settled in, Emily prepared for another quiet night of research and reflection. The temperature outside had dropped to record lows, and even her well-insulated cabin couldn't completely keep out the bitter cold. She pulled her thick wool sweater closer, grateful for the warmth of the wood stove that served as the heart of her modest home. 3 years of solitude had sharpened her senses to the mountain's rhythms. She knew the sound of every branch that creaked under the weight of snow, every wind pattern that swept through the valley. The wilderness had become her teacher, showing her a different kind of knowledge than what she'd gained in her years of academic study. As she settled into her evening routine, Emily's thoughts drifted to her former life. She'd been at the top of her field, specializing in wild feline behavior, publishing papers that had earned her recognition throughout the scientific community. But something had been missing, a connection to the very creatures she studied, one that couldn't be found through the sterile lens of academic research. The decision to leave hadn't been easy. Her colleagues had called it career suicide, warning her that she was throwing away years of hard work. But Emily had known, deep in her bones, that she needed this change. The mountains had called to her with a voice she couldn't ignore, promising something more authentic than the prestigious conferences and research grants that had once defined her success. As she prepared her evening tea, a habit she'd maintained from her city life, Emily reviewed her day's notes. The winter had brought changes to the familiar patterns of wildlife movement. She'd noticed fewer tracks in the snow, and the usual sounds of the forest had grown increasingly sparse. Something about this winter felt different, more intense than any she'd experienced in her time on the mountain. The solar-powered radio on her counter crackled with the evening weather report, warning of continued severe conditions. Emily made a mental note to check her emergency supplies in the morning, though years of living in isolation had taught her to always be prepared. Her small root cellar was well stocked, and she had enough firewood to last through several storms. As darkness settled over the mountain, Emily moved through her cabin, checking the locks on doors and windows, a habit born of respect for the wilderness rather than fear. The wind had picked up again, sending fresh waves of snow against the glass panes. She paused at each window, her trained eyes scanning the white expanse beyond, looking for any signs of wildlife seeking shelter from the storm. The mountains had taught her patience, showing her that the most significant moments often came when least expected. Tonight, as she settled into her favorite chair with her field journal, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The air felt charged with possibility, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. Little did Emily know that this night would mark the beginning of an extraordinary chapter in her life, one that would challenge everything she thought she knew about wildlife, survival, and the unexpected bonds that form in the harshest of circumstances. As she wrote in her journal, documenting the day's observations, the mountain winds continued their ancient song, carrying with them the first whispers of a story that would soon unfold. The blizzard intensified as night descended upon the mountains, transforming the landscape into a swirling canvas of white. Emily sat at her desk, the flickering lamplight casting dancing shadows on her weather-worn walls, when an unusual sound caught her attention. It wasn't the typical howl of the wind or the creaking of snow-laden branches. This was different, almost organic in nature. At first, she dismissed it as another trick of the storm. 3 years in the wilderness had taught her how the wind could mimic various sounds, from crying infants to prowling predators. But there was something about this particular sound that tugged at her professional instincts, awakening memories from her years studying wild felines. Emily moved away from her desk, her socked feet silent against the wooden floor. The sound came again, clearer this time, a weak, plaintive cry that seemed to hover between a moan and a whimper. Her heart began to race as she recognized the distinctive timbre. It was a sound she'd heard countless times during her research years, but never this close to human habitation. Reaching for her heavy winter coat, Emily's mind raced through possibilities. Wild animals rarely approached human dwellings unless driven by extreme circumstances. The severity of this winter had already forced many creatures to alter their usual patterns, but this felt different. Something about that cry spoke of desperation, of a last resort. The temperature gauge beside her door read -25 degrees Fahrenheit, conditions that could be lethal even to the hardiest mountain creatures. Emily pulled on her insulated boots and grabbed her emergency medical kit, a remnant from her research days that she'd maintained more out of habit than necessity. The wind nearly knocked her back as she opened the door, its fierce intensity making her grab the doorframe for support. Her covered porch offered minimal protection from the storm's fury. Snow had drifted against the railings, creating miniature mountain ranges of ice and frost. Emily's trained eyes scanned the darkness, her flashlight beam cutting through the swirling snow. The cry came again, closer now, and she turned toward its source. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There, huddled against her porch railing, was a sight that defied everything she knew about wild animal behavior. A female lynx lay curled in the snow, her magnificent fur coated with ice crystals. But it wasn't just the adult cat that caught Emily's attention. Around the exhausted mother, 3 tiny cubs shivered, their small bodies struggling against the mounting snowdrifts. The mother lynx's amber eyes met Emily's, and in that moment, something profound passed between them. There was no fear in those wild eyes, only exhaustion, and what Emily could only interpret as desperate hope. The big cat's sides heaved with labored breathing, and Emily's experienced gaze noticed subtle signs that suggested the animal might be carrying another litter, an extremely rare occurrence that spoke volumes about the severity of their situation. Emily stood motionless, her scientific mind warring with her instincts. Everything she'd learned in her years of research told her to maintain distance, to let nature take its course. But as she watched one of the cubs struggle to stand in the deep snow, she felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust, about the unexpected moments that change the course of lives. The wind howled louder, driving fresh snow across the porch. Emily knew she had only moments to make a decision. The cubs wouldn't survive much longer in these conditions, and their mother's state was critical. Yet taking in wild animals, especially predators, went against every protocol she'd ever learned or taught. As she stood there, snowflakes settling on her shoulders, Emily remembered why she'd left her academic career behind. It wasn't just about escaping the politics and pressures of university life. It was about finding a more authentic way to connect with the creatures she'd spent her life studying. Here, in this moment, that opportunity presented itself in its purest form. Moving with deliberate slowness, Emily began to back toward her door. The mother lynx's eyes followed her every movement, but the animal made no attempt to flee. Instead, she seemed to watch with an almost human-like intensity, as if understanding that this moment would determine her family's fate. Emily's hand found the doorknob, and she slowly pushed it open, creating a portal of warmth and light in the storm-darkened night. What happened next would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything Emily believed about wildlife conservation, human intervention, and the complex bonds that can form between species. As she stood in that doorway, the wind howling around her, Emily couldn't know that her decision would lead her down a path filled with unexpected allies, hidden dangers, and discoveries that would shake the foundations of her solitary world. The first light of dawn crept through Emily's frost-covered windows, illuminating an extraordinary scene in her modest cabin. The mother lynx, whom Emily had started calling Aurora in her mind, lay curled near the wood stove, her 3 cubs nestled against her side. The transformation of Emily's solitary sanctuary into a makeshift wildlife shelter had happened with surprising smoothness, defying everything she knew about wild animal behavior. Emily moved quietly through her morning routine, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Her years of field research had taught her the importance of establishing predictable patterns when dealing with wild animals. Aurora's eyes followed her constantly, alert but not aggressive, displaying an unusual level of trust that both intrigued and concerned Emily's scientific mind. The cubs, still weak from their ordeal in the storm, had begun showing signs of improvement. Emily observed them with professional interest, noting their behaviors in her field journal. "Cubs responding well to warm environment," she wrote, her neat handwriting filling the pages, mother displaying unprecedented level of tolerance to human presence. Possible signs of previous human contact or extreme circumstances forcing adaptation. As she prepared her morning tea, Emily's thoughts turned to the practical challenges ahead. Her cabin's supplies, while adequate for one person, would need careful rationing to accommodate her unexpected guests. The mother lynx's condition worried her most. Through careful observation, Emily had confirmed her initial suspicion that Aurora was indeed pregnant again, a rare occurrence that complicated an already complex situation. "You're quite the surprise package, aren't you?" Emily murmured softly, watching as Aurora gently groomed her cubs. The big cat's ears twitched at her voice, but showed no signs of distress. The bond forming between them seemed to transcend natural barriers, yet Emily remained acutely aware of the wildness that still burned in those amber eyes. Throughout the day, Emily documented every detail of her unusual guest's behavior. Her scientific training kicked in automatically, turning her cabin into a unique research environment. She noted feeding patterns, social interactions, and behavioral adaptations. The cubs, growing bolder with each passing hour, had begun exploring their new environment with typical feline curiosity. The smallest cub, distinguishable by a unique pattern of spots on its ear, caught Emily's particular attention. It displayed a remarkable boldness, venturing further from its mother than its siblings. Emily found herself drawn to its adventurous spirit, reminded of her own drive to break away from conventional paths. As evening approached, Emily faced her first major challenge. The storm outside had intensified again, and her firewood supply was running low. She would need to venture out to her storage shed, but leaving wild animals alone in her cabin went against every safety protocol she'd ever learned. Yet something in Aurora's steady gaze told her that trust went both ways. "I'll be right back," Emily said softly, more for her own comfort than any expectation of understanding. To her amazement, Aurora simply watched as she donned her winter gear and stepped outside into the biting cold. The trek to the woodshed took longer than usual, the deep snow and howling wind making each step a challenge. As Emily loaded her arms with firewood, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally shifted in her world. The solitude she'd chosen 3 years ago had been transformed into something entirely different, not quite broken, but evolved. Returning to the cabin, Emily found everything exactly as she'd left it. Aurora had moved only slightly, positioning herself to better watch the door. The cubs were asleep, their small bodies rising and falling with peaceful breaths. The scene struck Emily as surreal, a perfect tableau of wild and domestic existing in unlikely harmony. That night, as Emily made notes in her journal by lamplight, she began to understand that she was witnessing something extraordinary. The behavior of these wild animals defied conventional wisdom about wildlife rehabilitation. There was something more happening here, something that challenged her scientific understanding while awakening a deeper, more instinctive knowledge. The wind continued its relentless assault on the cabin, but inside a different kind of change was taking place. Emily found herself wondering about the circumstances that had driven this family to seek human help. In all her years of research, she'd never encountered anything quite like this. As she wrote her final observations for the day, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than simple survival. Looking up from her journal, Emily caught Aurora's gaze. The lynx's eyes held secrets, stories of survival and instinct that Emily could only guess at. But as she settled into her chair for the night, keeping watch over her unusual guests, Emily couldn't know that these secrets would soon lead her into a situation far more complex than she could imagine. A week had passed since Aurora and her cubs had taken refuge in Emily's cabin, and a routine had begun to establish itself. Emily found herself adapting to the rhythm of her wild guests, her scientific curiosity deepening with each passing day. The cubs had grown stronger, their playful antics bringing unexpected joy to her once quiet home. Aurora, too, showed remarkable improvement, though her advancing pregnancy required careful monitoring. That morning, however, something changed. Emily noticed it first in Aurora's behavior. A subtle shift in the lynx's demeanor. The big cat had become restless, moving frequently between the windows, her ears constantly twitching at sounds Emily couldn't hear. Years of studying wild felines had taught Emily to trust these instinctive warnings. Pulling on her heavy coat, Emily stepped out onto her porch for her regular morning check of the surroundings. The storm had finally subsided, leaving behind a pristine landscape of untouched snow. But as she scanned the area, something caught her eye. A disturbance in the perfect white blanket near the tree line. Moving closer, her heart quickened as she recognized what she was seeing. Footprints, human footprints. Emily knelt to examine the tracks more carefully, her trained eye picking up details that sent a chill through her body that had nothing to do with the cold. The prints were fresh, likely made within the last few hours, and they circled her cabin in a deliberate pattern. Someone had been watching her home during the night. Back inside, Emily found Aurora standing alert, her amber eyes fixed on the window. The cubs, sensing their mother's tension, had huddled together in the corner Emily had furnished with old blankets. The peaceful sanctuary of the past week suddenly felt vulnerable, exposed. Drawing on her years of wilderness experience, Emily began taking precautions. She checked every window, making sure the locks were secure, and took inventory of her supplies. Her satellite phone, usually relegated to a drawer for emergencies, was now kept within easy reach. But she couldn't shake the feeling that these measures might not be enough. As dusk approached, Emily sat at her desk, attempting to focus on her journal entries. The scratching of her pen couldn't mask the growing unease in her mind. In all her years of solitude, she'd never felt threatened in her mountain refuge. The wilderness had its dangers, certainly, but they were natural, predictable. This was different, an human intrusion into her carefully maintained world. Aurora's sudden growl broke through Emily's thoughts. The lynx stood rigid by the window, her fur slightly raised. Emily moved quietly to join her, peering out into the gathering darkness. For a moment, she saw nothing but shadows among the trees. Then a movement caught her eye, a flash of light, quickly extinguished somewhere in the forest's edge. Emily's mind raced through possibilities. The nearest town was hours away, and few people ventured this far into the mountains, especially during winter. The location of her cabin wasn't marked on any public maps. She'd chosen this spot specifically for its isolation. Anyone who found their way here had to have a reason. That night, Emily found sleep elusive. She sat in her chair, watching as moonlight painted silver patterns on the cabin floor. Aurora remained vigilant, her presence oddly comforting in the darkness. The cubs slept peacefully, unaware of the tension that filled their temporary home. In the quiet hours before dawn, Emily began formulating a plan. Her years of research had taught her the importance of documentation. She retrieved her old camera from storage, cleaning the lens with careful precision. Whatever was happening, she needed to create a record. If someone was watching her cabin, she would be watching back. Morning brought fresh snow and a deceptive sense of calm. Emily's routine continued, but now each action was accompanied by heightened awareness. She noticed details she might have missed before. Broken branches that couldn't be attributed to weather, disturbed snow in patterns that spoke of human presence. As she stood on her porch, surveying the pristine landscape, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something important. Aurora's continuing unease suggested that the danger hadn't passed. If anything, the lynx's behavior indicated that it might be growing closer. Emily returned to her desk and opened her journal to a fresh page. Day 8, she wrote, then paused, her pen hovering over the paper. How could she document this growing sense of threat without concrete evidence? Her scientific training demanded facts, data, observable phenomena. But everything about this situation defied traditional analysis. Looking over at Aurora and her cubs, Emily felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily on her shoulders. She had inadvertently become guardian to these magnificent creatures, and now it seemed that role might require more of her than she'd initially imagined. As she watched the smallest cub playfully paw at its siblings, she made a silent promise to protect them, whatever challenges lay ahead. The morning light revealed fresh snow outside Emily's cabin, but the pristine white surface did nothing to ease her growing anxiety. 2 weeks had passed since Aurora and her cubs had sought refuge with her, and each day brought new signs that their sanctuary might not be as secure as she'd hoped. The footprints she'd discovered were only the beginning. Now other disturbances suggested a more persistent presence watching her home. Emily stood at her window, sipping her morning tea while observing Aurora's behavior. The lynx had developed a pattern of pacing between specific points in the cabin, always pausing to stare intently through certain windows. Her cubs, growing stronger by the day, remained unusually quiet during these moments, as if sensing their mother's concern. "What do you sense that I'm missing?" Emily murmured, watching as Aurora's ears twitched at every subtle sound. Her years of studying wild felines had taught her that their instincts were rarely wrong. The lynx's behavior suggested a threat that was both near and persistent, something more coordinated than random wilderness wanderers. Moving to her desk, Emily began reviewing her recent journal entries. She'd started documenting every unusual occurrence, no matter how small. String pieces of disturbed snow that couldn't be explained by wind patterns, the occasional glint of metal among the trees that disappeared too quickly to identify. even the strange silence that sometimes fell over the forest, as if the local wildlife was holding its breath. A sudden movement caught her eye through the window. Aurora had gone rigid, her attention fixed on something in the distance. Emily grabbed her binoculars, following the lynx's gaze. At first, she saw nothing but the usual landscape of snow and trees. Then a shadow moved between the pines, too deliberate to be an animal, too careful to be a lost hiker. Emily's heart raced as she quickly grabbed her camera. By the time she focused the lens, the figure had vanished, but she kept watching, documenting the time and location in her journal. This was the closest any of the mysterious visitors had come to showing themselves in daylight. As evening approached, Emily found herself implementing new security measures. She'd started placing markers in the snow, small twigs arranged in patterns that would reveal if anyone had passed by during the night. Her windows, once left uncovered to welcome the mountain views, now had improvised coverings that could be quickly drawn shut. Aurora seemed to approve of these precautions, watching intently as Emily moved around the cabin securing their shelter. The cubs, picking up on the tense atmosphere, stayed closer to their mother than usual. The smallest one, which Emily had secretly named Scout for its curious nature, pressed against Aurora's side, its wide eyes following Emily's movements. That night, as the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, Emily sat in her chair near the wood stove, her journal open on her lap. She'd been documenting Aurora's pregnancy progression, noting the subtle changes in the lynx's behavior and physical condition. The upcoming birth would make their situation even more complicated, adding another layer of vulnerability to their already precarious position. A sharp crack from outside broke through her thoughts. Aurora's head snapped up, her eyes fixed on the back window. Emily moved silently to investigate, her flashlight ready but unlit. Through the glass, she could make out shapes moving in the darkness, more than one this time, their outlines barely visible against the snow. Emily's hand instinctively reached for her satellite phone, but she stopped short of making a call. Who would she contact? The local authorities were hours away, and she had no proof of any wrongdoing. Besides, something told her that involving officials might make the situation worse rather than better. Instead, she retrieved her old research camera and set it up near the window, its motion sensor activated. If someone was watching her cabin, she would gather evidence. Her scientific training had taught her the value of documentation, of building a case with observable facts rather than just suspicions. As she worked, Emily couldn't help but wonder about the timing of it all. Aurora's appearance at her doorstep, the mysterious watchers, the increasing boldness of their surveillance. It felt too coordinated to be coincidental. She glanced at the Lynx family, now huddled together near the stove. Aurora met her gaze with those intelligent amber eyes, and Emily felt again the weight of the unspoken trust between them. Later that night, as the wind howled outside and the cubs slept peacefully, Emily added a new entry to her journal. "The presence of observers continues to escalate," she wrote, her handwriting steady despite her unease. "Aurora's behavior suggests they're drawing closer. Questions remain. Who are they? What do they want? And most importantly, how did they know to look here?" The last question bothered her the most. Her cabin's location was deliberately obscure, chosen specifically for its isolation. Someone would have needed specialized knowledge to find it, especially in these weather conditions. As she closed her journal, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was much more to this situation than she yet understood. The discovery came at dawn. Emily had ventured out to check her morning markers when she found it. A steel trap, partially hidden beneath the fresh snow, its deadly jaws open and waiting. Her blood ran cold as she carefully examined the device. It was professional grade, the kind used by experienced trappers. This was no random placement. Someone had deliberately set it near her property. Using her field expertise, Emily dismantled the trap with practiced movements, her mind racing with implications. 3 weeks had passed since Aurora and her cubs had sought refuge in her cabin, and now this discovery confirmed her worst fears. The mysterious observers weren't just watching, they were preparing for something. Back inside, Aurora greeted her with an intense stare, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. The cubs played near the wood stove, blissfully unaware of the growing danger. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she added the morning's discovery to her journal, sketching the trap's design with scientific precision. Her years of research had taught her to document everything, no matter how disturbing. "We need to be more careful," Emily spoke softly to Aurora, who watched her with those intelligent amber eyes. The lynx had grown notably more protective of her cubs in recent days, keeping them away from the windows and responding to every unusual sound. Her advancing pregnancy made her movements more deliberate, yet she remained alert, her instincts clearly warning her of the approaching threat. Throughout the day, Emily found herself checking and rechecking the surroundings of her cabin. She discovered more signs of human activity: broken branches that hadn't been caused by snow weight, strange marks on trees that seemed to form a pattern, and most worryingly, what appeared to be communication equipment hidden among the dense undergrowth. The smallest cub, Scout, had taken to following Emily around the cabin, mimicking her watchful behavior. Its siblings remained closer to Aurora, but Scout seemed drawn to Emily's monitoring activities. Sometimes, when Emily stood at the windows scanning the tree line, the small cub would join her, its tiny head tilted as if sharing her vigilance. As evening approached, Emily began implementing new security measures. She hung thick blankets over the windows, leaving only small gaps for observation. Her emergency supplies, once stored in the shed, were now distributed throughout the cabin in case they needed to move quickly. The satellite phone remained charged and within reach, though she still hesitated to use it. The wind picked up as night fell, carrying with it the sound of branches creaking under heavy snow. Emily sat at her desk, updating her journal with the day's observations, when Aurora suddenly tensed. The lynx's attention fixed on the back door, her fur slightly raised. Emily moved silently to investigate, her heart pounding. Through a small gap in the window covering, she caught movement in the darkness. Multiple shadows moved between the trees, more coordinated than before. A beam of light briefly swept across the snow, quickly extinguished, but not before Emily noticed something that made her stomach turn. Bootprints, fresh ones, leading directly to her shed. Emily reached for her camera, careful to keep the lens hidden behind the curtain. She needed evidence, something concrete to validate her growing suspicions. As she watched, one of the shadows detached itself from the trees, moving with purposeful stealth toward her cabin. The figure paused, seeming to study the building's layout before retreating back into the darkness. That night, sleep proved impossible. Emily maintained a vigil from her chair, watching as moonlight filtered through the gaps in her window coverings. Aurora remained equally alert, her body positioned protectively around her cubs. The pregnant lynx's condition added an extra layer of urgency to their situation. They were running out of time before the new cubs would arrive. In the early hours of the morning, Emily made a disturbing connection in her journal. The timing of the mysterious observer's appearance coincided too perfectly with Aurora's arrival. Someone had known the Lynx family would come here, had perhaps even anticipated it. But how? And more importantly, why? As dawn approached, Emily found herself facing difficult questions. Her isolated cabin, once a sanctuary for research and reflection, had become the center of something far more complex. The presence of the trap confirmed that whoever was watching had no peaceful intentions, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still missing crucial pieces of the puzzle. Looking at Aurora and her cubs, Emily felt the weight of responsibility press heavily on her shoulders. She had chosen this solitary life to study and protect wildlife, and now that commitment was being tested in ways she never imagined. Whatever was coming, she knew she couldn't back down. Too much depended on her ability to unravel this mystery before it was too late. The generator's sudden silence jolted Emily awake. She dozed off in her chair, exhausted from maintaining constant vigilance. The cabin's temperature, usually carefully regulated, began to drop immediately. Aurora's eyes gleamed in the darkness, reflecting the dying embers from the wood stove. Emily's first thought was mechanical failure. The generator had been running continuously for weeks, after all. But as she pulled on her coat and boots, Aurora's low growl suggested something more sinister. The Lynx's behavior had become an early warning system that Emily had learned to trust implicitly. Grabbing her flashlight, Emily approached the window cautiously. The moonlight revealed fresh tracks in the snow leading to the generator shed, and her heart sank. This wasn't a mechanical failure. Someone had deliberately tampered with their power source. The timing couldn't have been worse. Aurora's pregnancy had advanced significantly, and the cubs needed consistent warmth. "We'll figure this out," Emily whispered, more to herself than to her wild guests. She moved quickly around the cabin, implementing her emergency protocols. Extra blankets were distributed, and she stoked the wood stove to compensate for the failing heat. The cubs, sensing the change in atmosphere, huddled closer to their mother. Scout, the smallest cub, watched Emily's movements with unusual intensity. Over the past weeks, the tiny Lynx had developed an almost uncanny ability to mirror her moods. Now, as Emily worked to secure their shelter, Scout maintained a vigilant pose that seemed almost human in its awareness. A metallic clang from outside made Emily freeze. Aurora's ears swiveled toward the sound, her body tensing. The noise had come from the direction of the generator shed, suggesting that whoever had sabotaged their power supply was still nearby. Emily's mind raced through options. She could investigate, but leaving the cabin meant potential exposure. Staying inside felt equally risky. They were effectively trapped without power. The satellite phone, their lifeline to the outside world, showed only one bar of reception. The storm that had been building all day was interfering with the signal, further isolating them. Emily had been hesitant to call for help, knowing that involving authorities might raise uncomfortable questions about her unusual house guests. Now, that decision was being forced upon her. As she contemplated their next move, Emily noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through the gaps in the window covering, she could see multiple lights moving through the trees. Unlike the previous furtive glimpses, these movements seemed more coordinated, more purposeful. The observers were no longer content to simply watch. Aurora's behavior confirmed Emily's fears. The Lynx had positioned herself between the windows and her cubs, her muscles visibly tense beneath her thick winter coat. Even in her advanced pregnant state, Aurora's protective instincts remained sharp. She moved with deliberate grace between vantage points, tracking the movements outside. Emily retrieved her journal, adding rapid notes about the night's events. Her scientific training demanded documentation, even in crisis. "Power compromised," she wrote, her usually neat handwriting showing signs of stress. Multiple observers confirmed. Aurora showing increasing signs of distress. Cubs at risk due to dropping temperatures. The immediate problem was heat. Without the generator, the cabin's temperature would continue to drop. The wood stove provided some warmth, but it wouldn't be enough for the entire space. Emily began creating a smaller shelter within the main room, using blankets and furniture to construct a makeshift den that would retain heat more efficiently. As she worked, her mind kept returning to the timing of it all. The sabotage of the generator wasn't random. It was a calculated move designed to force her hand. But what did they want? The presence of the trap she'd found earlier suggested their intentions weren't peaceful, yet they hadn't made any direct moves against the cabin. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the promise of another storm. Emily checked her supplies, counting the remaining firewood and food stores. They had enough for several days, but if the power remained out, their situation would become increasingly desperate. Aurora's pregnancy added another layer of urgency. The cubs would arrive soon, and they needed a secure, warm environment. In the darkness, Emily heard soft footsteps approaching her. Scout had left the safety of the group to join her vigil, pressing against her leg in an unexpected show of solidarity. The small cub's presence provided an odd comfort, a reminder of why she couldn't simply abandon their sanctuary to the mysterious threats outside. As the night deepened, Emily maintained her watch from the window, documenting every movement she could detect. The lights in the forest had taken up positions around the cabin, forming a loose perimeter that made her feel increasingly trapped. Yet something about their behavior suggested they were waiting. But for what? Emily looked at Aurora, who met her gaze with those intelligent amber eyes. The Lynx seemed to share her understanding that this was merely the beginning. Whatever plans their observers had, this power play was just the opening move in a game that was becoming increasingly dangerous. The morning brought no relief to their situation. Emily woke from her uncomfortable position by the window to find frost forming on the inside of the glass. Without power, the cabin's temperature had dropped dangerously low. Aurora and her cubs had retreated to the makeshift den Emily had constructed, but even there, the cold was becoming a serious concern. Emily's breath formed clouds in the air as she moved to check on her charges. Aurora's pregnancy had advanced significantly, and the stress of their situation wasn't helping. The Lynx's sides heaved with each breath, her magnificent fur coat puffed up against the cold. The cubs huddled close, with Scout, as usual, being the first to acknowledge Emily's presence. The sound of cracking branches outside drew their attention. Emily moved cautiously to the window, keeping low and out of sight. Through the frost-covered glass, she could see fresh tracks in the snow, multiple sets moving with purpose around her property. The observers had grown bolder, no longer bothering to hide their presence. Emily's journal lay open on her desk, its pages filled with increasingly urgent observations. Day 24, she wrote, her hands shaking slightly from both cold and tension. Temperature dropping critically, Aurora showing signs of early labor, unknown observers maintaining perimeter, generator remains compromised. The words seemed inadequate to convey the gravity of their situation. A sudden glint of metal in the morning light caught her eye. Someone had left something on her porch, deliberately placed where she could see it from the window. Emily's heart raced as she recognized the object, a heavy-duty animal trap, similar to the one she'd found earlier, but this one was new and unmarked. It wasn't just equipment abandoned in the snow, it was a message. Aurora's low growl drew Emily's attention back inside. The Lynx had managed to rise despite her condition, her eyes fixed on something beyond Emily's view. Following her gaze, Emily noticed movement at the edge of the clearing. A figure, less cautious than before, checking what appeared to be monitoring equipment hidden in the trees. The implications hit Emily like a physical blow. These weren't random observers. They had professional equipment, coordination, and most worryingly, patience. They were setting up for something specific, and Emily had a sickening feeling it had everything to do with Aurora's imminent delivery. Scout pressed against Emily's leg, the small cub's body trembling slightly. Whether from cold or fear, Emily couldn't tell, but the gesture strengthened her resolve. She moved quickly through the cabin, gathering supplies into strategic locations. If they were forced to move quickly, she wanted to be prepared. The satellite phone's weak signal mocked her from the desk. Even if she could get through to authorities now, what would she tell them? That she was harboring a family of wild lynx? That unknown observers were threatening them? Her situation would raise more questions than it would answer. As the day progressed, Emily noticed a change in Aurora's behavior. The lynx had become increasingly restless, moving between different positions in the den, her breathing more labored than before. Emily's experience told her these were early signs of labor. The cubs would be coming soon, ready or not. The timing couldn't have been worse. Without power, maintaining a suitable temperature for newborn cubs would be nearly impossible. Emily had already used much of her emergency firewood, and venturing out to the woodshed meant exposing herself to whatever waited in the trees. Late in the afternoon, a new sound caught their attention, the distinct whir of mechanical equipment. Emily peered through the window to see camera equipment being set up at various points around her property. The observers were documenting everything, preparing for something specific. Emily's scientific mind raced through possibilities as she added to her journal. The professional equipment, the coordinated surveillance, the timing of it all. Someone had known about Aurora's pregnancy, had perhaps even tracked the Lynx family to her cabin. But how? And more importantly, what were they planning to do once the cubs arrived? As darkness fell, the temperature dropped even further. Emily had consolidated their living space to the area around the wood stove, creating a tight cluster of blankets and furniture that trapped what little heat remained. Aurora lay in the center, her cubs pressed close, while Emily maintained her vigil nearby. The night brought new sounds, voices carried on the wind, the crunch of boots in snow, the metallic click of equipment being adjusted. Their observers were setting up for something, preparing for a moment Emily could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. In the darkness, Emily reached out to stroke Scout's fur, finding comfort in the small cub's trust. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, she knew, and with Aurora's condition deteriorating, their options were becoming increasingly limited. Whatever was coming, Emily realized, would require everything she had learned in her years of wildlife research. And perhaps more importantly, everything she had learned about trust and survival in these past few weeks. The breaking point came with the dawn. Emily had spent another sleepless night watching Aurora's increasingly labored breathing when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of vehicles approaching through the snow. The isolation she had once cherished had become their greatest vulnerability. Help was hours away, but threats could arrive at any moment. Through the frost-covered windows, she could make out at least 3 sets of headlights cutting through the early morning darkness. Their observers had apparently decided to abandon subtlety. Aurora sensed the change immediately, her powerful muscles tensing despite her exhausted state. The cubs, including the ever-vigilant Scout, pressed closer to their mother, responding to her anxiety. Emily's hands shook as she made what might be her final journal entry. Day 25. Multiple vehicles approaching. Aurora showing advanced signs of labor. Temperature critically low. Options limited. The clinical words belied the fear and determination coursing through her veins. Years of scientific detachment crumbled in the face of the immediate threat to her charges. The vehicles stopped just beyond the tree line, their headlights creating long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Emily counted at least 6 figures moving in the pre-dawn light, setting up what appeared to be professional-grade equipment. These weren't random hunters or curious locals. This was a coordinated operation. Aurora's sudden sharp intake of breath drew Emily's attention back inside. The lynx's labor was progressing faster now, her sides heaving with increased frequency. The timing couldn't have been worse. Moving her would be impossible, but staying put made them terrifyingly vulnerable. The cubs sensed their mother's distress, huddling closer, while Scout maintained a protective stance at the edge of their makeshift den. A sharp knock at the door shattered the tense silence. Emily's heart leaped into her throat as a voice called out, the first direct communication from their observers in all these weeks. "Miss Carter, we know you're in there. We need to talk about what you're protecting." The voice was professional, almost cordial, but Emily could hear the steel beneath the politeness. Her mind raced through options, each seeming worse than the last. The satellite phone still showed no signal. The storm that had been building all night was interfering with reception. They were truly alone. Moving silently, Emily gathered her emergency supplies closer to Aurora's position. The Lynx watched her movements with those intelligent amber eyes, seeming to understand that something crucial was about to happen. The cubs, picking up on the tension, remained unusually still, their small bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Ms. Carter, please be reasonable. This doesn't have to be difficult. We just want to document the birth. Think of the scientific value." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. Scientific value. How many times had she used that same phrase in her research papers? But this was different. These people weren't interested in conservation or protection. Their actions spoke of other motives, ones that made Emily's skin crawl. Aurora's breathing had become more labored, her powerful body preparing for the imminent birth. Emily knew they were running out of time. The observers outside were clearly aware of the Lynx's condition. They had timed this confrontation perfectly, waiting until Aurora was at her most vulnerable. The temperature in the cabin continued to drop as the last of their firewood burned in the stove. Emily had wrapped the cubs in every blanket she could spare, but it wouldn't be enough for newborn kittens. Without power, without help, their situation was becoming increasingly desperate. A new sound cut through the pre-dawn silence, the mechanical whir of equipment being set up. Through gaps in the window covering, Emily could see camera equipment being positioned around the cabin. They were preparing to document whatever happened next, regardless of her cooperation. Scout pressed against Emily's leg, the small cub's presence both a comfort and a reminder of what was at stake. In the weeks since Aurora had sought refuge in her cabin, Emily had watched these cubs grow stronger, had seen their personalities develop. The thought of them being treated as mere scientific specimens made her physically ill. The voice outside came again, closer this time. "We're preparing to enter, Ms. Carter. Please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. We have all the necessary permits and authorizations." Emily looked at Aurora, their eyes meeting in the dim light. The Lynx's gaze held a mixture of pain, trust, and something else. A fierce determination that Emily felt echoing in her own heart. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all night finally broke, sending sheets of snow against the cabin windows. The wind howled through the trees, creating an otherworldly backdrop to their crisis. Emily knew that soon she would have to make a decision that would affect not just her own future, but the lives of every creature that had come to depend on her protection. The sound of breaking glass shattered the pre-dawn silence. One of the cabin's back windows had given way under the pressure of the storm, or perhaps something else. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it swirls of snow and a new level of urgency to their already desperate situation. Aurora's labor had intensified, her powerful body preparing for the imminent arrival of her new cubs. Emily moved quickly to block the breach with blankets, her mind racing. Through the gaps in her makeshift barrier, she caught glimpses of movement outside, multiple figures converging on her cabin, their shapes dark against the snow. The mechanical whir of cameras continued, punctuated now by radio chatter and the crunch of boots on frozen ground. "Ms. Carter," the voice outside had taken on a harder edge, "we know about your research. We know why you really left academia." The words froze Emily in place. "Your papers on lynx breeding patterns drew quite a bit of attention, especially your theories about rare multiple pregnancies in extreme conditions." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Emily's last research paper before leaving academia had documented a controversial hypothesis that certain environmental stresses could trigger multiple pregnancies in lynx populations, a previously unknown survival mechanism. The academic community had dismissed her findings, but someone had clearly been paying attention. Aurora let out a low growl, her amber eyes fixed on the window. The cubs huddled closer to their mother, with Scout maintaining its protective position beside Emily. Through the storm's fury, she could hear more vehicles arriving, their engines growling in the distance. "Think about your career, Ms. Carter," the voice continued. "Documented proof of your theory, visual evidence of a multiple pregnancy in extreme conditions. We can make sure you get full credit. Your reputation would be restored." Emily's hands clenched into fists. Her reputation. That's what they thought this was about. She looked at Aurora, remembering the night the Lynx had sought refuge on her porch. This wasn't about scientific validation or career advancement. It was about trust, about protecting something precious from those who would exploit it. The smallest cub, Scout, pressed against her leg, its small body trembling. In that moment, Emily understood with crystal clarity why Aurora had chosen her cabin, her sanctuary. The Lynx hadn't just been seeking shelter from the storm. She had been running from these people, perhaps for weeks, protecting her unborn cubs from those who would turn their birth into a spectacle. A new voice joined the chorus outside, one that sent chills down Emily's spine. "Emily, it's Professor Matthews." The voice belonged to her former academic advisor, the man who had once championed her research before publicly dismissing her findings. "We don't have to be adversaries here. This could be your vindication." The betrayal stung, even after all these years. Matthews had known where to find her, had perhaps even anticipated Aurora's arrival. The elaborate surveillance, the professional equipment, the careful timing. This had been planned, waiting for the perfect moment when the pregnant Lynx would be most vulnerable. Aurora's breathing had become more rapid, her sides heaving with increasing frequency. The cubs, sensing their mother's distress, remained unusually still, their small bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort. The broken window had allowed precious heat to escape, and the temperature in the cabin was dropping rapidly. Emily's scientific mind raced through options, analyzing and discarding possibilities. The observers outside had the advantage of numbers and equipment, but they also had a clear agenda. They needed Aurora alive and the birth documented. That gave her some leverage, some room to maneuver. Moving quickly, she began gathering specific supplies: her medical kit, emergency blankets, water containers. If they wanted to document this birth, they would have to do it on her terms. She wouldn't let Aurora's trust be betrayed, wouldn't let these cubs become mere specimens in someone's research paper. The storm continued to intensify, its fury matching the tension building around the cabin. Through the swirling snow, Emily could see more equipment being set up: powerful lights, additional cameras, what looked like portable heating units. They were preparing for a long siege, determined to wait out either the birth or her resistance. Scout's sudden alert posture caught Emily's attention. The small cub's ears were forward, its body tense as it stared at something through the gaps in the window covering. Following its gaze, Emily saw movement in the trees. Not the observers this time, but something else. Something that made her heart leap with sudden hope. As dawn began to break over the mountain, Emily made her decision. She had chosen this solitary life not to escape her past, but to find a better way to protect the creatures she studied. Now, with Aurora's trust and the lives of both current and unborn cubs in her hands, she would prove that her choice had been the right one. The first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, creating an almost peaceful scene that belied the tension surrounding Emily's cabin. Inside, Aurora's labor had progressed significantly, her powerful body preparing for the imminent arrival of her new cubs. The existing cubs, including the ever-vigilant Scout, remained huddled close to their mother, their small bodies providing what warmth they could in the increasingly cold cabin. Emily moved with purposeful efficiency, her years of field experience guiding her actions. She had arranged her medical supplies within easy reach and positioned emergency blankets strategically around Aurora's makeshift den. The broken window remained covered, though cold air still seeped through the makeshift barrier, creating swirling patterns of frost on the cabin's walls. "The weather's only going to get worse, Emily," Professor Matthews called from outside. "You can't maintain adequate temperature in there without power. Let us help." His voice carried a false note of concern that made Emily's skin crawl. She had once trusted this man, had believed in his integrity as a scientist and mentor. Through gaps in the window covering, Emily could see the elaborate setup they had created around her cabin. Powerful lights bathed the area in artificial daylight, while multiple cameras stood ready to document every moment. A large tent had been erected nearby, filled with what appeared to be sophisticated monitoring equipment. This was no hasty operation. They had prepared meticulously for this moment. Aurora's sudden, sharp intake of breath drew Emily's attention back inside. The Lynx's amber eyes met hers, filled with both pain and trust. In that moment, Emily remembered something from her early research days, a detail that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now took on new meaning. Lynx mothers sometimes sought out specific locations for birthing, returning to places where they had successfully raised cubs before. "They've been tracking you for a while, haven't they?" Emily whispered to Aurora. "That's why you came here. You knew this area would be safe." The Lynx's steady gaze seemed to confirm her suspicion. This wasn't a random choice driven by desperation. Aurora had deliberately sought out Emily's cabin, perhaps recognizing in her a protector rather than an observer. The radio chatter outside increased, accompanied by the sound of more equipment being positioned. "We're setting up heat lamps now," Matthews announced. "Once we restore warmth to the cabin, we can proceed with proper documentation. Think about your legacy, Emily. This could revolutionize our understanding of lynx breeding patterns." Legacy. The word echoed in Emily's mind as she looked at the vulnerable family under her protection. Her true legacy wasn't in academic papers or research grants. It was here, in the trust this wild creature had placed in her. Aurora had chosen her precisely because she had walked away from those who would exploit nature's mysteries rather than protect them. Scout's alert posture caught Emily's attention again. The small cub was staring intently at something through the window, its body language showing interest rather than fear. Following its gaze, Emily noticed movement in the trees beyond the observer's lights, subtle shifts in the shadows that spoke of something or someone else watching the scene unfold. Emily's hands moved to her journal, adding what might be her final entry. Aurora's choice of location deliberate, previous success in area likely, multiple observers present, but not all hostile. Her scientific training demanded documentation, even now, but these notes were different. They were a record of trust rather than merely data. The storm continued to intensify, its wind drowning out some of the activity outside. Emily could hear frustration creeping into the observers' communications as they struggled to maintain their equipment in the deteriorating weather. Their carefully planned operation was being challenged by nature itself, introducing an element of chaos they couldn't control. Aurora's breathing pattern changed, signaling that the birth was imminent. Emily positioned herself beside the lynx, her movements calm and assured despite the chaos surrounding them. The cubs, sensing the importance of the moment, maintained a respectful distance while staying close enough to provide comfort to their mother. Outside, the observers' spotlights created a stark contrast between light and shadow, but Emily's attention was drawn to the darkness beyond their artificial day. Something was moving out there, something that made her heart race with sudden hope. Perhaps Aurora's choice of location had been even more deliberate than she'd initially realized. As the wind howled around the cabin, Emily made her final preparations. She had spent years studying these magnificent creatures, learning their patterns and behaviors. Now that knowledge would serve a different purpose, not to document or study, but to protect and preserve the very thing that had drawn her to wildlife biology in the first place, the raw, untamed spirit of nature itself. The storm's intensity reached a fever pitch, sending waves of snow against the cabin's walls. Inside, Emily worked with focused determination, her attention divided between Aurora's progressing labor and the increasingly aggressive movements outside. The observers had begun to position themselves closer to the cabin, their patience wearing thin as the weather threatened to derail their carefully planned operation. "This is your final warning, Emily." Professor Matthew's voice carried over the wind. "We are prepared to enter the cabin. Don't force us to take measures that could distress the subject." The clinical terminology, referring to Aurora as the subject, confirmed everything Emily had come to understand about her former mentor's true nature. But Emily had noticed something the observers had missed, too focused on their equipment and cameras to read the subtle signs in the wilderness around them. The movement in the shadows beyond their lights had become more pronounced, more purposeful. Scout had noticed it too, the small cub's attention repeatedly drawn to specific points in the darkness beyond the artificial glare. Aurora's sudden sharp movement drew Emily's attention back inside. The Lynx had shifted position, her powerful body instinctively seeking the optimal position for birth. But there was something else in her behavior, a purposefulness that went beyond mere biological imperative. She was waiting for something, timing her movements to some internal rhythm that Emily was only beginning to understand. Through the gaps in the window covering, Emily could see the observers' frustration mounting. Their expensive equipment struggled against the storm's fury, cameras and lights swaying in the intense wind. The weather had become an unexpected ally, disrupting their careful plans and creating chaos in their ordered documentation. "The Forest Service will be here within the hour," Matthews called out, his voice betraying a hint of desperation. "They'll have questions about your unauthorized handling of protected wildlife. Be reasonable, Emily. Let us handle this professionally." Emily almost laughed at the irony. Professional. As if there was anything professional about ambushing a pregnant wild animal, about trying to turn a natural miracle into a controlled experiment. She looked at Aurora, seeing in those amber eyes the same wild spirit that had drawn her to wildlife biology in the first place. Scout's sudden alertness caught Emily's attention. The small cub had moved to a new position, its gaze fixed on something through the broken window. Following its line of sight, Emily saw what the observers' lights had hidden, dark shapes moving through the trees, drawing closer with each passing moment. The forest was responding to Aurora's presence in ways the scientific equipment could never measure. Emily's mind raced back to her early research, to the patterns she'd documented but never fully understood. Lynx weren't just solitary creatures. They maintained complex social networks, invisible to human observation, but vital to their survival. Aurora hadn't just chosen this location for its safety. She'd chosen it because she knew help would come. The wind suddenly shifted, carrying with it new sounds, subtle movements in the underbrush, the soft crunch of snow under practiced paws. The observers, focused on their technology and cameras, remained oblivious to the gathering presence around them. Nature was mounting its own response to their intrusion. Aurora's breathing changed again, becoming more focused, more controlled. She was timing something, Emily realized, coordinating her labor with forces beyond human understanding. The existing cubs pressed closer to their mother, instinctively participating in this ancient dance of survival and protection. Emily moved swiftly, gathering her essential supplies into a single pack. Her years in the wilderness had taught her to read the signs, to understand when nature was preparing to assert itself. The observers thought they were in control with their lights and cameras and professional equipment. They didn't understand that they were witnessing something far more powerful than their instruments could capture. The storm reached a new level of intensity, the wind howling through the trees with almost supernatural force. The observers' lights flickered, their cameras struggling to maintain focus in the whiteout conditions. In their frustration, they had begun to make mistakes, creating gaps in their carefully maintained perimeter. Scout pressed against Emily's leg, its small body trembling with anticipation rather than fear. The cub's behavior confirmed what Emily had begun to suspect. They weren't trapped in this cabin. They were waiting, participating in a plan far more sophisticated than anything human technology could devise. As dawn approached, Emily made her final preparations. The observers outside thought they were documenting a simple biological event, but they were about to witness something far more profound. A demonstration of nature's ability to protect its own, to adapt and survive in ways that defied human expectation and control. The storm had reached its crescendo, creating a natural symphony of howling winds and swirling snow. Inside the cabin, Emily watched as her carefully crafted plan began to unfold. Aurora's labor had reached a critical phase, but the Lynx maintained an almost supernatural composure, her movements synchronized with something beyond human comprehension. The observers outside had begun to lose their professional demeanor. Their expensive equipment, battered by the storm, was failing systematically. The powerful lights flickered and dimmed, creating dancing shadows that concealed the growing number of shapes moving through the darkness beyond their perimeter. "The equipment's freezing up," a voice called out over the wind. "Professor Matthews, we're losing video capability." The frustration in their voices was palpable, their carefully orchestrated documentation crumbling in the face of nature's raw power. Emily moved silently through the cabin, positioning herself near the broken window. Scout followed her movements, the small cub's behavior reflecting an understanding far beyond its years. Through the gaps in the makeshift barrier, she could see what the observers couldn't, dozens of eyes reflecting in the darkness, drawing closer with each passing moment. "Emily, this is madness!" Matthews shouted, his composure finally breaking. "You're risking years of potential research. Think about the contributions to science." His words were nearly lost in the wind, but their desperate tone carried clearly to Emily's ears. Aurora let out a soft sound, almost like a purr, drawing Emily's attention. The lynx's eyes met hers, conveying a message that transcended species barriers. The cubs, including Scout, had taken up strategic positions around their mother, their small bodies tensed in anticipation. The first sign that their situation had fundamentally changed came with a series of sharp cracks from the forest's edge. The observers' cameras, mounted on tripods, began toppling one by one as dark shapes darted between them. The professional crew, so focused on their equipment, failed to notice the subtle orchestration of these accidents. "Something's out there!" one of the crew members called out, panic edging into his voice. The powerful spotlights swung wildly, trying to catch glimpses of movement that seemed to come from all directions at once. But the lights, designed for documentation rather than detection, only created deeper shadows for nature's agents to utilize. Emily's heart swelled with understanding as she recognized what was happening. Aurora hadn't just sought out her cabin for shelter. She'd led her pursuers into a trap of nature's own making. The complex social networks Emily had theorized about in her research were proving to be far more sophisticated than even she had imagined. Through the storm's fury, new sounds began to emerge. Subtle growls, the soft pad of paws in snow, the rustle of movement through underbrush. The observers' perimeter, already weakened by the weather, began to collapse as their attention scattered in multiple directions. "The equipment!" Matthews shouted as another camera crashed to the ground. "Secure the documentation!" His priorities remained clear, even as chaos erupted around him, his scientific ambition blind to the greater forces at work. Aurora's breathing changed suddenly, becoming more focused and intentional. Emily knew that the moment they'd been waiting for had arrived. With practiced efficiency, she began implementing the final phase of their plan. The cubs, responding to some unspoken signal, gathered closer to their mother. Scout pressed against Emily's leg one final time, its small face turned up to hers with an almost human expression of trust and determination. In that moment, Emily fully understood her role in this drama, not as a scientist documenting nature's mysteries, but as a guardian helping to protect them. The storm reached its peak intensity, the wind howling with almost supernatural force. The observers' remaining lights flickered and died, plunging the scene into natural darkness. In that moment, Emily heard Matthew's voice rise in frustration and confusion. "Where are they? I can't see anything!" But Emily could see. Her years in the wilderness had taught her to trust more than just her eyes. The shapes moving through the darkness were familiar to her now. A gathering of nature's forces, drawn by ancient bonds and instincts that human science was only beginning to understand. Aurora's family had come, not just to witness a birth, but to ensure its protection from those who would exploit it. The darkness outside the cabin had become absolute, broken only by the occasional flash of the observers' failing emergency lights. Inside, Emily worked with practiced precision, her movements synchronized with Aurora's increasingly purposeful breathing. The moment they had been preparing for was finally here. Through the broken window, the sounds of chaos reached a crescendo. The observers' carefully maintained equipment lay scattered and useless, their professional operation dissolving into confusion. Professor Matthews's voice carried over the wind, desperately trying to maintain control of the situation. "Regroup! Get those lights back up!" he shouted, but his commands were drowned out by a new sound, a chorus of soft growls emanating from the darkness. The forest itself seemed to be responding to Aurora's presence, manifesting guardians that no scientific paper could have predicted. Emily's years of research suddenly clicked into place with crystal clarity. The complex social behaviors she'd documented, the patterns that her colleagues had dismissed as coincidence, they were all part of something far more sophisticated. Aurora hadn't just found random shelter in Emily's cabin, she'd led her pursuers into the heart of her extended family's territory. Scout, the smallest cub, took up position near the window, its small body alert but unafraid. The other cubs gathered close to their mother, instinctively understanding their role in what was about to unfold. Aurora's breathing had become deeply focused, her powerful body preparing for not just birth, but a coordinated effort that transcended human understanding. Outside, the observers' perimeter continued to collapse. Emily could hear their confusion and growing fear as shadows moved with purpose through their camp. Equipment crashed to the ground, tents collapsed, and the artificial boundaries they'd established crumbled in the face of nature's coordinated response. "Emily!" Matthew's voice carried a note of desperation now. "You don't understand what you're interfering with." This documentation could revolutionize our understanding of wild feline behavior. But his words only confirmed that he was the one who didn't understand, who couldn't see that he was witnessing something far more revolutionary than any documented observation. Aurora let out a soft sound, almost like a purr that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. The response was immediate. Shapes moved through the darkness with renewed purpose, drawing closer to the cabin. Emily caught glimpses of powerful bodies, gleaming eyes, and purposeful movements that spoke of intelligence far beyond mere instinct. The smallest cub, Scout, suddenly stood at attention, its ears forward and body tense. Through the window, Emily saw what had caught its attention. The observer's last remaining light had captured a momentary glimpse of what they were facing. Multiple lynx, their winter coats gleaming in the brief illumination, had surrounded the cabin. These weren't just random wild animals. They were Aurora's extended family, drawn by bonds that human science was only beginning to comprehend. "My God," she heard Matthews whisper as he finally saw what was happening. "This is impossible. The documented social patterns don't allow for this kind of coordination." His scientific certainty crumbled in the face of evidence that challenged everything he thought he knew about these creatures. Emily moved swiftly, implementing the final phase of their plan. With practiced efficiency, she gathered her essential supplies and positioned herself near Aurora. The Lynx's amber eyes met hers with an intelligence that no research paper could ever fully capture. They were no longer just observer and subject. They were partners in something extraordinary. The storm's fury reached its peak, the wind howling with almost supernatural force. Through the chaos, Emily heard the observers' remaining equipment fail, their voices rising in confusion and awe. Nature had asserted itself in a way that no amount of scientific documentation could explain or control. Scout pressed against Emily's leg one final time, its small body trembling with anticipation rather than fear. Above the storm's rage, a new sound emerged, a chorus of calls that seemed to ripple through the darkness around the cabin. Aurora responded with a soft growl of her own, a signal that set in motion the final act of their incredible drama. The observers' voices rose in astonishment as their last light flickered and died, plunging the scene into natural darkness. But Emily could still see, her eyes long adapted to the wilderness night. What she witnessed in those moments would forever change her understanding of the creatures she had spent her life studying, a demonstration of nature's ability to protect its own in ways that defied human expectation and control. And dawn broke over the mountain with an almost supernatural serenity, the storm having passed as suddenly as it had arrived. The scene around Emily's cabin had transformed completely. Where there had been chaos and artificial lights, now there was only pristine snow and profound silence. The observers' expensive equipment lay scattered and buried beneath fresh drifts, their careful documentation plans reduced to nothing more than frozen metal and broken cameras. Inside the cabin, Aurora rested peacefully, her new cubs nestled safely against her side. The birth had been perfect in its natural simplicity, untainted by artificial observation or scientific documentation. Scout and its siblings had maintained their protective vigil throughout, their small bodies providing warmth and comfort to their mother during her labor. Emily sat nearby, her journal open but momentarily forgotten as she absorbed the magnitude of what had transpired. The night had revealed something that went far beyond her original theories about Lynx social behavior. She had witnessed not just cooperation, but a level of coordinated protection that would revolutionize understanding of these magnificent creatures if she chose to share it. "Emily?" Professor Matthews' voice came quietly from outside, all traces of authority now gone from his tone. "We're preparing to leave. The Forest Service, they've explained some things about this area, about what it means to the local wildlife population." The hesitation in his voice suggested he was still struggling to process what he had witnessed. Through her window, Emily could see the remaining observers packing up what equipment they could salvage. Their movements were hurried, almost nervous, as if they finally understood they were the intruders here. The forest around them had returned to its natural state, but now they could sense what they had missed before: the watchful presence of Aurora's extended family still guarding the perimeter of their territory. Scout approached the window, its small body carrying itself with new confidence. The cub had proved itself a vital link between two worlds, helping Emily understand the true depth of trust Aurora had placed in her. Through Scout's eyes, she had learned to see beyond scientific observation to something far more profound: the raw, unfiltered spirit of nature itself. The sound of vehicles starting up carried through the crisp morning air. Emily watched as the observers' convoy began their retreat, their ambitious documentation project abandoned in the face of forces they couldn't control or comprehend. Professor Matthews remained behind briefly, standing in the snow as if wanting to say more. "Your original research?" he finally called out, his voice carrying a mix of respect and regret. "About complex social behaviors in lynx populations. We should have listened more carefully." With those words, he turned and followed his team, leaving Emily's sanctuary to return to its natural peace. Aurora's soft purr drew Emily's attention back inside. The lynx's amber eyes held a depth of intelligence that no research paper could ever fully capture. She had chosen Emily's cabin not just as a safe haven for birth, but as a fortress from which to orchestrate a stunning demonstration of nature's ability to protect its own. Moving quietly, Emily began documenting the events in her journal, but with a new perspective. Her scientific training had taught her to observe and record, but the night's events had shown her something far more valuable: the importance of knowing when to protect nature's secrets rather than expose them to exploitation. The new cubs, tiny and perfect, squirmed against their mother's warm fur. Scout and its siblings had settled into a protective formation around them, their small bodies creating a living barrier of family love and protection. The scene represented everything Emily had left academia to find: the raw, unfiltered truth of wildlife behavior, untainted by human intervention or scientific ambition. Outside, the mountain landscape had returned to its pristine state, erasing all evidence of the previous night's drama. But something had fundamentally changed. The observers had come seeking documentation of a rare biological event, but they had instead witnessed something far more profound, a demonstration of nature's inherent wisdom and power to protect its own mysteries. Emily's cabin, once a simple research outpost, had become something far more significant. It stood now as a testament to the deep bonds that can form between species when trust replaces exploitation, when protection supersedes documentation. The night had proved what Emily had always suspected, that sometimes the most important scientific discoveries are the ones we choose to protect rather than publish. Spring arrived gradually in the Rocky Mountains, melting away the last traces of that extraordinary winter. Emily's cabin had returned to its quiet routine, though everything about her life had fundamentally changed. The days of solitary research had been transformed by the profound lessons learned during those intense weeks with Aurora and her family. Standing on her porch one crisp morning, Emily reflected on how different her understanding of wildlife had become. Her old journal entries, filled with scientific observations and theoretical frameworks, now seemed almost naive compared to the deep wisdom she had witnessed firsthand. Aurora and her family had shown her that there were aspects of nature that defied clinical documentation, secrets that deserved protection rather than publication. Professor Matthews had made several attempts to contact her through official channels, offering co-authorship on papers about Lynx social behavior. Emily had declined each time, knowing that some truths were better preserved in their natural state than dissected in academic journals. The real legacy of those winter weeks wasn't in any documentation or research paper. It lived on in the thriving family of Lynx that now called these mountains home. Scout, true to its adventurous nature, still visited occasionally. The small cub had grown into a confident young lynx, but it never lost the special connection it had formed with Emily during those crucial days. Its appearances always brought news of the extended family, Aurora's new cubs growing strong, the complex social network maintaining its vigilant protection of their territory. Emily's research continued, but with a fundamentally different approach. Her new journal entries focused on understanding rather than documenting, on protecting rather than publishing. She had learned that true wildlife conservation wasn't about academic papers or scientific recognition. It was about maintaining the delicate balance that allowed nature's mysteries to flourish undisturbed. The Forest Service, enlightened by the events of that winter, had quietly designated the area as a protected habitat. No official reports mentioned the extraordinary display of lynx social behavior, but the rangers who patrolled the region always nodded respectfully to Emily when their paths crossed. They understood that some aspects of nature were best left unrecorded, protected by silence and trust rather than academic documentation. One morning, as dawn painted the mountains in shades of pink and gold, Emily made her final entry about those remarkable events. "The true measure of scientific understanding," she wrote, "isn't in what we can document and explain, but in what we choose to protect and preserve." Aurora's gift wasn't just trust, it was a glimpse into the profound wisdom of nature's own ways of protecting its precious secrets. As she wrote these words, a familiar sound drew her attention to the window. There, in the early morning light, stood Scout with its own cubs, introducing a new generation to the human who had earned their family's trust. Emily smiled, understanding that her legacy would live on not in research papers or academic acclaim, but in the continued flourishing of these magnificent creatures who had chosen to share their world with her. The mountains had taught her that the greatest discoveries often come not from observation and documentation, but from earning the trust of the wild spirits who call these peaks home. In choosing to protect rather than expose their secrets, Emily had found a deeper truth about conservation and the delicate balance between human curiosity and nature's right to privacy. As the morning sun rose higher, bathing the landscape in golden light, Emily watched Scout and its family disappear into the forest. Their presence was a reminder that some stories are better left untold, some mysteries better left unexplored. The true power of nature lies not in what we can study and document, but in what we choose to protect and preserve for generations to come. Dear listeners, we hope Emily's journey has touched your hearts and opened your eyes to the profound mysteries of nature. Her story reminds us that sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from observation and documentation, but from earning the trust of the wild spirits around us. Just as Emily chose to protect rather than expose nature's secrets, we invite you to join us in honoring and preserving these precious mysteries. For more captivating stories that explore the delicate balance between humans and wildlife, we've prepared a special playlist you'll find linked to the left of this video. If Emily's tale has moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day, we bring you unique stories that celebrate the complexity and beauty of our natural world. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Emily's position? How has this story changed your perspective on wildlife conservation? Join our community of nature enthusiasts and help us spread these important messages of conservation and respect for the wild. Remember, like Emily, we all have a role to play in protecting nature's secrets. Stay tuned for more extraordinary tales that will challenge your understanding and touch your heart. Together, we can make a difference in preserving the wild spirits that share our world.